Thank you to our musicians today for the message that has no words. Today's message that I'll be sharing with you is called Resist Much, Obey Little, a homage to moral ambiguity. However, as the message took shape, it actually changed, which happens sometimes when you title something and then you get to it. So it's actually a homage to moral imagination. And this message is inspired by Pete and Carol Ekstrom and conversations we had. They won the auction sermon at this year's fundraiser, and I just want to specify that the ideas and opinions are my own and do not reflect what they would say or think, and so my hope is to leave plenty of time for community conversation so that we can all engage in this important topic. This message begins with 3 readings. Reading 1 from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 28 to 38. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. After he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany, at the place called Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say, 'The Lord needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owner said, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord needs it." Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus upon it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. Now, as he was approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." And Jesus answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." Reading 2, excerpt from Walt Whitman's poem, Caution, published in the amazing book, Leaves of Grass. To the states, or any of them, or any city of the states, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved, no nation, no state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. Reading 3, a poem from Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. 1. April 2nd, today, is Palm Sunday in the Christian tradition. Services across the world will be waving palm branches as they retell the story that I read to you of Jesus' march into Jerusalem for the last time. By this point in his life, Jesus of Nazareth was what we would call today an influencer. He had amassed a following whom paraded with him as he rode this donkey into Jerusalem, which was the seat of power of the religious and political elite. Now, this coincided with the Jewish Passover, and anytime I talk about Jesus, I just like to remind us all that Jesus was Jewish. So he, amongst many pilgrims, were going into Jerusalem for this celebration, and the Roman government would often also parade through the streets with the army, kind of a military force to be seen to all of those who were gathered. So for many, this story is interpreted as a political demonstration, an act of civil resistance. Riding into town on a donkey was a political parody to the show of might and force of the army. And some interpret it as a message from Jesus and his followers saying, "You may be the king of the empire, but I am the king of peace." In the book The Last Week, which documents this week from Palm Sunday to Easter, which is co-written by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, they suggest that Jesus' actions and teachings disrupted aspects of the way that many societies are normalized and how they're organized. They argue that it was a disruption to the status quo of three areas. One, political oppression that marginalizes people. Number two, economic exploitation, whereas the rich get richer, you know the story. And number three, of religious legitimization that says, don't try to change things, this is how God wants it. So they believe that this story of riding the donkey into Jerusalem actually confronted all three of those status quo areas. Now, Marcus Borg differentiates the pre-Easter Jesus from the post-Easter Jesus. The pre-Easter Jesus being Jesus of Nazareth, the human being, the person in this story, from the post-Easter Jesus, the Jesus of Christianity, Jesus the Christ. This story is very much situated, I believe, in the pre-Easter Jesus, both chronologically as well as the story itself. And this story takes place as, like, literally this man, who historically we have evidence, is convicted and sentenced to the capital punishment system of his time, execution by hanging on a cross. This is what happens on Good Friday, which is coming up before the resurrection story, which is Easter morning, which I believe Bucky will be engaging next Sunday. But Marcus Borg interprets all of this through the lens of kind of political science and says that Jesus was killed because he stood against the kingdoms of the world for an alternative social vision. The domination system killed Jesus as the prophet of the kingdom of God. This is the political meaning of Good Friday. 2. Walt Whitman's excerpt from Courage is also the epigraph to Erica Chenoweth's book, Civil Resistance. Erica is a contemporary political scientist and professor. Erica uses the pronouns they, them, so that's the pronouns I'll use for Erica. Now, Erica was a self-described skeptic of nonviolent resistance and civil resistance, and at a conference on this topic, vocally criticized this technique of making change. One of the other attendees, Maria Steffen, challenged Erica to prove it. The two of them went on to create the first comprehensive and systematic research project on nonviolent campaigns. They focused it from 1990 to 2006. Now, when I say nonviolent campaigns or civil resistance, what comes to mind? Let's just name a few, say, even from the last 10 years, just in America. Black Lives Matter. Say it again. Women's March. Yes. Any others? Civil rights. A little more than 10 years ago, but yes, exactly. Water protection. Yes. I'm sorry? Climate protection. Yes, climate justice work. Absolutely. Occupy Wall Street. Hashtag Me Too, Standing Rock, Justice for Breonna Taylor. I think we got it. We know what we're talking about. So Erica defines civil resistance in this way: a form of collective action that seeks to affect the political, social, or economic status quo without using violence or the threat of violence against people to do so. it is organized, it is public, and it is explicitly nonviolent in its means and its ends. So Erica gives examples such as labor strikes and mass non-cooperation, such as not riding the buses in the civil rights movement, in addition to things like marches and some of the more visual parades and public things that we may see. So the outcomes from this research especially surprised Erica. Nonviolent campaigns are 2 times more likely to succeed in their goals than violent insurgencies. And this trend is increasing over the time that they studied, from that 1990 to 2006. And number 2, the tipping point of 3.5% of the population equaled change every time through nonviolent or civil resistance. Some of the key characteristics: well organized, that all people could be included, not just those who had the physical ability to march or something like that, but that these were also visible, which allowed people who might have been on the fringe to say, oh, I can see it, it's legitimate, and it increases the diversity of, say, professions that join, skill sets that come to the table, and people with positional power. But some of the even more notable conclusions came from Erica's own transformation as they realized that they entered into the work with the following: that not only is it permissible, but it was comfortable to think that violence works. And number 2, that it is acceptable to assume that violence is necessary to resolve conflict. Interpreting Palm Sunday as civil resistance, I think we can all agree that the Jesus movement has surpassed 3.5% of even the global population and has changed the status quo in many ways, at least from the times when we were talking about. But those nonviolent civil resistance means to change, riding the donkey, right? I would argue changed when Christianity began to identify as empire, as authority, the very authority that Palm Sunday was demonstrating against. 3, Martin Niemöller was a Lutheran minister in Germany who was actually supportive of the Nazi Party until Hitler moved the party more and more towards authoritarianism. He began to speak out. He began to organize. It landed him in Dachau prison camp for 8 years, after which he wrote the poem that I spoke earlier that concludes, "Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." During World War II, the use of military force, from this country especially, was justified as a way to combat the existential and very real threat to all of humanity that the Nazi authoritarianism posed. Violent means justified for a greater good. Yet the casualties, both human deaths as well as the partial soul deaths and complete soul deaths, I would argue, experienced through the violent aggression, are literally still here today. I just was having a conversation with a group, and people were tracing back experiences in their childhood and their lives to World War II, things that are so complicated. There's still collective trauma, especially in Germany and that part of the world, that is still being healed today, is still stuck in many ways. I attended a lecture a couple years ago, not that many, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, 2 representatives from Congress, Dave Obey, a Democrat, Tom Petrie, a representative, both from Wisconsin. They had both recently retired. They did a lecture circuit telling the story of their time in office because they had come in as young representatives at a time when they were still being mentored by those who had been in Congress during World War II. They were mentored in a very specific way. The message was this: never again. We have to work across the aisle. We have to build relationships. Never again can we get to that point of the escalation of violence. because the only alternative to war is diplomacy. And the only way to get diplomacy is for us to work together. As they became mentors themselves to the younger congressional representatives and leaders, they were disregarded in this day and age as rhinos and dinos, Republican in name only, Democrat in name only, by their colleagues. So they took their message to the road to appeal to citizens to hear this message, never again, that came at such a price. Embedded in their message, I heard a moral, but I would argue also a spiritual appeal towards anti-authoritarianism. In Erica Chenoweth's book, they share a warning that we are in a time of rising authoritarianism, right? We hear in the news about Israel looking to repeal the judicial power. We know that in the United States, there's been a trend towards authoritarianism, but so it is in India, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, Russia, where civil rights, especially for marginalized people, continuously are rolled back. From voting and elections processes to the persecution and bullying of journalists, which just happened in Russia as well, it makes organizing ever more challenging. So civil resistance is a powerful force, on average more powerful than violent insurrections, based on the research, but it is undermined by authoritarianism. So how does this apply to a real-world scenario, such as the Russian invasion in Ukraine? Many will argue that the time for diplomacy has passed, and the opportunity for civil resistance is no longer viable. Many argue that it is time to take military action for other countries to begin to support this insurgency because of the civilian casualties, the crimes of war, the disgusting and horrific news that comes out from what's happening in Ukraine, as well as the global food shortages that are leading to starvation. These are all existential and real threats to humanity everywhere. So is it too late to use these other methods? Well, one of the solutions when democracy isn't working is actually more democracy. It's one of the few times that I understand it when more is better. Like, more isn't always better, right? Like, more police don't necessarily mean safer, more peaceful communities. You know, more food doesn't necessarily mean that starvation and food shortages have been assuaged, but there is a trend that when you have more democracy, when people get more involved, the results begin to create that change and that tipping point. And the same is with civil resistance. In the same way, when the people rise up, when you hit that 3.5%, change does happen. So I guess this is where I find the hope in this conflict and in other conflicts around the world, is the possibility that civil resistance can work. What if every person impacted by the scars of war, the generational trauma, PTSD, or who has been oppressed, who has had authoritarian abuses, bullying, did I leave out anybody? What if the global citizenry reached out, stood up to support the Russian people in civil resistance? Now, I know coming from America, this could be fraught. There's a lot of brokenness in relationships with people in many countries, but there's also vector economics. Who are your friends that are their friends? Political science uses this all of the time. What about the people of Kazakhstan? Could we somehow reach out and empower civil resistance there that they could then bring to their Russian family members? What about the 900,000 Russians who have left since the beginning of the war, fleeing for safety because they were outspoken about what had happened and what was happening? These folks have migrated to many different countries: Turkey, Armenia, Greece, Spain. There are strongholds of people who are active in the resistance. These immigrants fled fearing for their own safety. and now they are without a home and looking for a home. I feel like often when we talk about this conflict, we dehumanize Russian people. We talk about Russia as kind of a warmonger, a monster, a demon of war, when the Russian people are also perhaps victimized by this. Now, civil rights resistance is by its very nature nonviolent in means and ends, but I think we can all agree that there's a lot of violence that happens. After all, Jesus was killed for the political demonstrations, and today the kind of demonstrations he was doing continue to inspire anti-Semitic hate crimes, right? So these stories, like the one I just read today, are part of the fodder that continues this. Civil rights movement grounded with songs like we sang this morning before they went out on demonstrations to steel themselves for what they knew could be horrific abuses to their bodies. So in some cases, there's going to be violence either way. But from what I understand is the scars of war continue to be passed on from generation to generation to generation. And the hope of civil resistance, even when it is violence against people's bodies, also gets passed down generation to generation. And it is not something that continues the cycle of oppression. And I do not think it should happen. I do not think that people in nonviolent protests should have to take rubber bullets into their abdomens and suffer from horrible health consequences like so many clergy in Ferguson, Missouri are still dealing with today. I believe that it takes a kind of moral imagination to find a way through conflicts such as this. The Russian people have a historical trauma, I believe, around resistance. If you know the story of Russian gulags, I was able to visit a Russian gulag where all political prisoners, anyone who had done resistance, were kept. And there's a story about one of the women's prisons. It's now in present-day Pavlodar in Kazakhstan. And these women were out by this river, and the locals came across the river and began throwing rocks at them. And the guards laughed, saying, "See, even the locals think you're terrible." And they walked away to allow this to happen. They weren't rocks. They were little dumplings of bread. The people made it look like they were inciting violence against these people, but they were able to scoop these up and eat them. It was an act of compassion. It required moral imagination. How do we get these human beings food? The Black Lives Matter movement has also differentiated between nonviolence movements, passive, the emphasis on the type of response for those who are being harmed, and anti-violence, resistance of violent people, institutions, and processes, the demand for accountability when violence does occur, the ethical commitment to harm no person, and the commitment to hold those accountable who are doing the harm. We have a rich history in the global community of civil resistance. We have so many pieces to pull from. We could start with the Center for Peace in Hiroshima. We could start with the stories from our own lives or those that are inspiring us. Because as Martin Niemeyer's poem has been adapted and adopted by many, from the terminally ill to contemporary minority populations, but the meaning is the same. Often it is those who are victimized, those who are struggling, who are marginalized, who have been harmed, those are the ones who have to lead the resistance, and often they do it by themselves until others join them. To me, this poem is one of the most compelling liberation statements. And by liberation, I mean that we are bound together, and no one is free until everyone is free. Some people believe that religion shouldn't be political, but what happens in our world is what we reflect in our theology, in our beliefs. They are not separate. To put it very simply, Unitarianism means we come from a common source. universalism means we share a common destiny. I believe there is hope for any violent conflict for those in Ukraine and all over the globe. And for me, this hope lies in that all people with all abilities have the opportunity to be part of civil resistance. It requires an understanding of authoritarianism and what that does to everybody. And it requires a bit of a backs against the wall, that feeling, that understanding of liberation as mutual and bound together, even when it isn't your particular identity that is being expressed or exploited. That is the message I have to share with you today. And I would welcome, instead of doing the hymn at this point, I would like to move right into the community conversation and invite reflections. I have a couple of questions on the slide.